Hey, Matt. Thanks very much for having me part of the podcast. I'm actually quite humbled and honored to be here.
Oh, I appreciate that. I appreciate it very much. I think you give a great insight to a great many things, which I think beyond the Canadian border, beyond our own issues that we could use your insights on a lot. I think it's refreshing in many ways.
Well, thank you. I'll do what I can.
Yes, I'm curious as to, especially your background in linguistics. What do you think with formulation of new or the desire to create new anti-terror laws poses on both practitioner and courts with persecutions or even just the finding of evidence and so forth?
Yeah. Those are really great questions. And it's funny you make that allusion because, of course, I came into intelligence a little bit backwards in a way. I mean, I was a linguist. I did languages and linguistics at University of Western Ontario, which apparently now is called Western University. Shows how old I am, and really just fell into intelligence purely serendipitously. I won't bore your listeners with the big details, but I basically got my job during the early 1980s recession when it was really hard to find work, and as an arts graduate, it was next to impossible. Even engineers weren't getting jobs back then, which was quite extraordinary for the time. And I ended up working for Communication Security Establishment, which of course is Canada's signals intelligence organization. I spent 17 and a half years there. They hired me because I was good at languages. And this was during the Cold War. And there was a bunch of us, about a dozen of us at the time, were the only people that were not concerned with the Soviet Union and its allies. This, of course, was, the number one priority is, the nukes the Soviets had. And, are we going to get to that, the catastrophic Third World War in which nuclear weapons would predominate. But myself and a few very young university grads were told to look at the rest of the world. And of course, that meant looking at a bunch of incoming intelligence in a variety of languages. So that's why I was hired in the first place. The more I became an intelligence analyst per se, the languages kind of took a little bit of a back seat. I mean, the languages were there as a vehicle. They were there as a tool to use to interpret the raw intelligence, to extract what the Canadian government needed in the terms of the requirements that they levied upon the intelligence agencies to answer certain questions. But I guess, once a linguist, always a linguist. And I even started teaching linguistics at Carleton. I did that for 15 years from the early 1990s into the mid 2000s, and then took a 2-year sabbatical to do doctoral work in linguistics at the University of Toronto. So I think about language a lot. And I think about language a lot in terms of how it can help and how it can hinder. Let me give you a current example, which I find is really fascinating. You may have heard that the WHO, World Health Organization, has recently decided to stop using terms like the China strain or the Brazil strain or the UK strain when it comes to the COVID-19 virus. They're going to use Greek letters, alpha, beta, gamma, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And I kind of get where this is coming from. It comes from a place where there's a concern that some people, morons and idiots, to be perfectly honest, will say, oh, the China variant, that means that, all Chinese people are disease vectors, or all Asians are bad people who, spread viruses by coughing and spitting on us. And, there's a lot of talk these days about Asian hate, even here in Canada. People, engaged in acts of violence, or even less than that, online tirades or yelling at people, or being not nice to Asian Canadians. So I understand where this thing is coming from. But at the same time, we're sacrificing accuracy for something else.
Yes.
I'm a big believer that if you can't label something what it is, it's really hard to deal with it. And this certainly extends to terrorism as well. And you may be aware that the Canadian government, since the Trudeau administration came in 2015, has launched this initiative to stop using terms like Islamist terrorism.
Yes.
Or right-wing terror. It's all ideologically motivated violent extremism, or IMVE. This is the newest acronym that's being bandied about. And I actually appeared before a Commons committee a couple of days ago that's looking at the issue of terrorism in Canada. And I'm concerned. I'm concerned that if you are unable to be as accurate as possible in the language that you use to describe the threats that you are faced with, it does undermine your abilities to deal with them.
Yes.
So again, another example, as of we're early June now, 2021, if you look at the news on any given day or what's happening in the world from a terrorism perspective, I'll get to the word terrorism in a second. 99.9% of all attacks carried out anywhere in the world are carried out by Islamist extremists.
Yes.
Whether it's Afghanistan or Somalia or Nigeria or Mali, or I mean, you name it, Mozambique, Pakistan, the list goes on and on and on and on and on. If you're going to try to do counterterrorism, and that's the gamut of everything from diverting people from the pathway of becoming terrorists all the way to investigating, arresting, and charging people at the other end to try to prevent people from dying, you have to be able to dedicate your resources to the critical mass, if you will, of where the threat's coming from. And if your only tool you have is to say, well, we're going to look at IMVE, then where do you devote as many resources to far right terrorism, which is really even as a decimal error when it comes to international efforts, as opposed to Islamist extremism? Or do you dedicate the resources where the threat is greatest? And I have this fear that by watering down the language, we can't do that. Even the word terrorism, I read a fascinating piece yesterday in the Miami Herald, of all things, about a shooting at, I think it was a wedding or a party or something. And it looks like gang warfare. There was indications two gangs had been insulting each other, the usual bullshit you hear with, Bloods and Crips and all this kind of stuff. And one gang got revenge on the other gang. It happens all the time. I mean, you insult me or you diss me, I'm going to get you back, kind of thing. And the police said this is an act of domestic terror. And I'm thinking, no, it's not. It's a gang shooting.
Yes.
And I fear that we're entering this era where everything has become terrorism.
Yes.
The violent incel attack in Toronto in April 2018, when Alec Manassian drove down Yonge Street, was not an act of terrorism. It was an act of, at most, hateful misogyny. And I think that we are really muddying the waters by basically calling everything terrorism. And as I've said, when everything is terrorism, nothing is terrorism. So language does matter. It matters big time. It matters for your first responders, your CSISs and RCMPs of this world. It matters for governments and developing programs to deal with this. So I think it shouldn't be taken lightly. And I'm also, as a linguist, I know that meanings change, words change over time. Dictionaries don't define words; people define words.
Right.
Dictionaries are historical. The minute they're written, they're historical documents. But I think that collectively we have to take much greater care at using the right terminology to refer to the right phenomena.
Yes, I thank you, Phil, and I concur with that as well, especially with the incident in Toronto. I think that was an act of misogyny. It was not an act of terrorism. I think it is certainly the case that if we label everything as terrorism, nothing becomes terrorism. Everything becomes just a melting pot of things, and we don't really have any accurate mental tools, as it were, to work.
Sorry, Matt, and I think that if you put more and more stuff on the plate of the security service. So CSIS is a security intelligence organization. It's not a criminal intelligence organization. CSIS doesn't investigate crimes.
Right.
They investigate threats to national security as defined by Section 2 of the CSIS Act. When you keep throwing more and more stuff on the agency, you do a couple of things. First of all, you dilute the resources. There's only so many women and men that work at CSIS on investigations. And if you put more on their plate, that means you're spreading them very, very thin. Secondly, do you really want CSIS looking at elements that really law enforcement should be looking at? I think the answer is no. And that dilutes the waters even further because there's a delicate dance between CSIS and law enforcement. CSIS collects intelligence, not evidence. And there are mechanisms by which CSIS can share in a very limited fashion what it knows about certain things to aid law enforcement. But there really is a firewall between the two because the last thing CSIS wants is to appear in court. Because they don't collect to what's called an evidentiary standard in Canada. Other security intelligence services do in other countries. Canada doesn't. So I think if you start, piling on these things onto the CSIS mandate, you're going to be broaching, or rather breaching, that divide, and it's not going to be a good development for Canada.
No, I think that would be true whether it be the U.S., Germany, any country for that matter. Once that there are separations for a reason. There are separations for reasons, for historical reasons, for reasons of national security, for reasons of analytical work and pragmatic work. You need
resource allocation.
Precisely.
Yeah.
I mean, in keeping with that, what do you think? If my recollection is, I'm sure you would know the accurate number on this, but I believe it's something like roughly 260 definitions of terrorism or terrorist. With that, how can agencies, intelligence agencies, but I guess also governments as well, act accordingly with these definitions, certainly with the academic community. I mean, depending what article you read, you're going to get a definition of radicalization, and terrorism might be interchangeable in many ways.
Right.
That's not a good thing. I don't find that to be pleasing. I find that to be very unsettling, because if we can't communicate with each other on these issues that affect us all, and come to a kind of even a moderate consensus as to what some definitions mean. What methods are we use?
You do raise a good point, and you're right. There are well over 200 definitions of terrorism. With all due respect to my academic colleagues, I don't give a rat's ass how they define terrorism, because it's not relevant to what CSIS, the RCMP, or other security intelligence services do. They can write whatever they write in their journals, and again, I'm not demeaning or poo-pooing what academics do, but effectively their product really isn't something that has a significant influence or bearing on what our protectors do. So, they can have these arguments in their journals and online, and I really don't care. Governments is different. As I said, CSIS has a mandate, and the mandate which allows it to investigate potential terrorism in Canada is contained under what's called Section 2C of the CSIS Act. So Section 2 defines the four main areas that CSIS is authorized to look into. And for your listeners who aren't aware, I mean, CSIS came out of the old RCMP security service, so it came out of law enforcement, but it was created in 1984 as a separate civilian agency that was not a law enforcement agency. And Section 2C states basically that CSIS has the responsibility and the mandate, legitimate legal mandate, to investigate acts of serious violence that are carried out or planned for political, religious, or ideological reasons. So that's what the CSIS Act says. At least that wording is also reflected in the Canadian Criminal Code in Section 83.01, where terrorist activity, not terrorism, terrorist activity is defined as a serious act of violence that is carried out or planned for political, ideological, or religious reasons. So that's kind of what we use as our definition, if you will, of what terrorism is. Now, even with that, you get into arguments. What is ideology? Again, going back to the Manassian attack in April of 2018, I came out quite strongly saying I didn't think he was ideologically motivated. I thought he was a misogynist. And I got taken to the cleaners by a lot of people who accused me of being misogynist by not acknowledging that he was ideologically motivated. I said he's motivated by hate. Hate's not ideology. Some ideologies are hateful, most aren't. But we're making this error, and we're equating two different terms: ideology and terrorism. And I don't think that's useful. And so, as a result, despite the clarity of the criminal code, despite the clarity of the CSIS Act, you're still going to have these arguments in terms of what is a legitimate series of activities that you want your security service to investigate. And, Matt, I wasn't born yesterday. I'm convinced that, since the advent of the Trudeau government here in Canada, there's been a lot of, I know this for a fact. I know this from sources I believe to be reliable. There has been pressure put on CSIS to investigate some of these things that weren't investigated when I was there. And I mean, I'm not saying that CSIS shouldn't change its investigative focus. I mean, things change. Right. No, I mean, CSIS was created during CSIS's early mandate was dominated by counterintelligence, because the Soviet Union was still in power in 1984. But of course, things change. So it's not that CSIS shouldn't change what it's doing, but it shouldn't change what it's doing based on political dictates. And I'm seeing a very worrisome trend in Canada that seems to ignore the fact that 99.6% of all terrorism acts in the world are carried out by Islamist extremists, to say, well, we've been there, done that, got the T-shirt. Now all we're going to look at is the far right, however that's defined. White supremacism, white nationalism, neo-Nazis. QAnon is part of that, apparently. Anti-vaxxers,
Yes, and this
all that kind of stuff.
This merely goes back to what we were saying moments ago, the compiling of various things. If everything becomes terrorism, nothing is terrorism. If everything is far right, nothing is far right. What are we saying? What are we saying?
Exactly.
I think that's a problem too. As much politically as it is just the general discourse of narratives too. I think that's a problem with narratives, how it's presented, and not just news media. I think it's a problem amongst individuals. I think it's a multifaceted issue, really. which we
The other
don't.
thing too is, the governments have a very interesting relationship with intelligence agencies. I mean, intelligence agencies are there to serve governments.
Right.
I mean, we get requirements. We want you to tell us about X, Y, or Z. These requirements. I mean, I was at CSE. I was part of a mission to actually get foreign intelligence requirements for decades. And we would go and talk to people. So, what do you need to know this year? And we would rank the requirements and try to collect and try to advise. At the same time, intelligence services are independent of government. This notion that there has to be a hands-off relationship in many ways. You can't have governments telling security services what to say and how to say it. I just put a podcast up on my website today with an old friend of mine, Greg Fife, who used to be the head of the Privy Council office as International Assessment Secretary. And we talked about this issue about how, intelligence agencies, maybe the phrase speaking truth to power is not the correct one, but intelligence agencies are there to tell governments uncomfortable things.
Yes.
And I think you want a really good example, which is kind of tangential to our talk today. Think about what, CSIS has been telling the government about Chinese interference for the past 15, 20 years.
Yes. Yes.
And now governments seem to realize that, yes, China is not our friend, and they're doing all kinds of nasty things about gaining information they shouldn't have access to, influencing Canadians. They're harassing Canadian Uyghurs. Yes. They're harassing Canadian Tibetans. They're harassing Canadian people of Hong Kong origin. We told them that 20 years ago. And for whatever reason, they didn't want to hear that message. In fact, we were roundly criticized for being so vocal about it.
Right.
That's what intelligence agencies are there for, is to give you uncomfortable truths. And then it's your decision whether to act on them. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. But the intelligence says, hey, here's what it is. It's over to you. We don't make policies. We don't make decisions on this. Here's what we know. Here's how confident we are in terms of how accurate it is. The ball's in your court now. So I do think that, we don't want governments saying to CSIS, drop this and start doing that. Exactly. Because CSIS is the organization that's telling you it's the best place to know what's happening, but through its human sources, through its operations, through its investigations. So I do think there has to be that gap, if you will, between governments and what security intelligence services do.
No, I concur. I think I would be very shocked who would not concur with that. That's just good government. That's just good separation of government policy, who potentially politicians who may be in there for 5 years, 2 years, 1 year, as opposed to intelligence agency or any agency for that matter, who are doing that full term, who this is what they're doing. You don't want short-term policy affecting long-term analytical work. It's not good mixture.
Exactly.
And I think even that, entwining into our conversation is, and this might be for certain generations, perhaps younger, maybe some of middle generation at this point, the misunderstanding that the phenomenon that is terrorism is not something that just merely appeared out of the late 20th century. It's not something that is just now we are talking about. This may be now because it's so predominant. Maybe because of twining in, we're talking about the narratives that everything now seems to be a terrorist-related act or an act of terrorism, and so widely used the term now. But it's not, which I think most people are misunderstanding. That it's not something that had just appeared in the late 20th century. This is, as you perfectly mentioned in your book, The Peaceable Kingdom, it is perfectly something that we have right from our early days of Confederation. We have acts of it. But I wonder, Phil, do you think that it is because, I would even say that even the assassination of Franz Ferdinand was an act of terrorism. That are currently, that the manifestations of terrorism, whether it be religiously, ideologically driven, politically driven, whatever the motivations, the manifestations have made it so much more, given more variety, if you will, as opposed to what might be considered traditional means of terrorism.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Matt. I often say we're living in a post 9/11 generation. 9/11 has defined for most people, not just of your age, but a lot of people, 9/11 was kind of like our what was a Kennedy moment for my older brothers. I was only 2 in Kennedy, but my brothers remember the Kennedy assassination in 1963. I was too young. I was around, but I was too young. That kind of defined politics for many people.
Right.
That was the bursting of the balloon of American exceptionalism. America, the great shining city on the hill, blah, blah, blah. I think 9/11 has done that for a whole other generation of people, because prior to 9/11, most people didn't give a rat's ass about terrorism. No, they didn't think about it. They didn't wallow in it. They didn't obsess about it. It just was a it's something that happened over there, and it rarely struck our shores. And I think the sheer enormity of 9/11, not just in terms of the death toll, which is almost 3,000, but I mean, hitting New York and Washington, my God.
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't like hitting, no disrespect, Timbuktu and Harare.
Right.
There's a massive terrorist attack in 1998 in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, in which 500 people were killed. Nobody cared because it's just the two African countries which we couldn't find on a map, right? Nobody,
Right.
Again, no disrespect to the victims, but it just didn't register, I think, for a lot of people. But you're right. Terrorism is generally recognized as a phenomenon that kind of started in the mid-19th century. But depending on how you define it, it probably goes back a lot further in time.
Right.
But for our argument's sake, we're going to say it starts in the middle of the 19th century with the so-called anarchist wave of terrorism. And if you're listeners, I recommend the work of David Rappaport, who is a professor emeritus at UCLA. His wave theory of terrorism really, and I've had him on my podcast. He's a really brilliant scholar in the States. He walks people through this. But you're right. Canada as a nation, as an independent nation, saw the light of day on July 1st, 1867. And scarcely a year later, we had our first act of terrorism on Canadian soil when a Fenian terrorist, and the Fenians were Irish nationalists, largely US based, who were basically trying to get Britain to accord Ireland independence from the United Kingdom. A Fenian nationalist / terrorist assassinated Thomas D'Arcy McGee, who was a member of Parliament and a so-called Father Confederation. Can I use that term, Father Confederation, in 2020? Am I going to get taken to task for that? On Spark Street in Ottawa, like a block from Parliament Hill. And a man called James Patrick Whalen was found. He was hanged. He was killed. That was less than a year after Canada was formed. Then you fast forward the better part of a century, and of course you get the Flq crisis in Montreal, in which Quebec nationalists were letting off bombs and killing people in the province of Quebec to try to get independence from Canada, which culminated, of course, in October 1970 when they took Quebec Minister Pierre Laporte and a British Trade Representative, James Cross, hostage. They killed Mr. Laporte. Mr. Cross was rescued, but that led to the imposition of the War Measures Act. That was martial law in October of 1970. I remember those days. And then, again, you go to the 80s, you have Armenian terrorist attacks in Ottawa in which they killed Turkish diplomats. We had, of course, Air India, which prior to 9/11 was the single greatest act of terrorism, at least from an aviation perspective, in the history of the planet. 329 people died. That was a plot carried out by Canadian Sikh terrorists who wanted, again, going back to this independence theme, right? They wanted India to grant independence to Punjab. And then, of course, the Islamist wave in the 90s and 2000s and 2010. So, no, it's been, we here in Canada are very proud of the fact that we're multicultural. We see ourselves as sort of world citizens, and that extends to our terrorism. We've had nationalist terrorism, we've had ethnic terrorism, we've had domestic terrorism in the sense of the FLQ, we've had religious terrorism. We've had left-wing terrorism in a group called the Squamish Five in the early 1980s. They tried to bomb a plant in Toronto, which they felt was making components for guidance systems for U.S. cruise missiles. And you have the attack in the mosque in Quebec City in January of 2017, in which 6 people were killed by a right-wing extremist. We have it all. But this is important for your listeners to realize, even though we've had it all, 2 things. First of all, more terrorist attacks have been stopped than have occurred, thanks to CSIS and the RCMP. And secondly, in terms of the death toll, about a dozen people have died in Canada from terrorism since 1867. So let's not make this out to be bigger than it is. It's important. It's important that CSIS and the RCMP have the resources for it. But, more people die in Afghanistan in a week that have died in Canada in 154 years.
I think
so. Perspective is really, really important.
I think you're exactly right, Phil. I concur. I think that's something that should be heavily known more by Canadians, that is that few number. I mean, those numbers still matter. That is not to take away from the victims, the families, the generations past. But we are extraordinarily fortunate. I think we have, you might say, Canadian exceptionalism in that respect. We are exceptionally fortunate. For whatever factors have come into play, we are very fortunate. But even with respect to what you're speaking on of Air India, that is something that I think, although that most people probably don't even remember that wasn't even considered something that affected Canada. The address was to India itself. The apology was condolences and to India. I mean, that's a shift too, right there. The acknowledgement that wasn't even considered mournful to Canadians, but mournful
Yeah.
to the passengers, who most were Canadian dual citizens or Canadian citizens.
Yeah.
This is that's a shift too, I think, in the narrative, you might say, in the outlook, the perspective.
I think so. At the time, as you said, the Prime Minister was Brian Mulroney, and he extended condolences to the Indian Prime Minister. And you're absolutely right. Those people were Canadians.
Yes.
Whether they were citizens or permanent residents or what, it doesn't matter. And the fact that those bombs were placed on those planes by Canadian Sikh terrorists put those bombs on those planes. And so it was our problem. And it's hard for me to say this as a former intelligence professional. It was a failure on our part to prevent it. Mm-hmm. We had some intelligence that something was happening, but it wasn't good. Other intelligence wasn't good enough, or it wasn't acted upon quickly enough. And then look what happened.
Yes.
But yeah, I think that you are seeing a shift in that narrative, and that's a good thing. I think that as Canadians, whether an act of terrorism occurs here or is carried out abroad by a Canadian, we've had many Canadians carry out attacks, which I outlined in my book, The Peaceful Kingdom, in Somalia, in Algeria, et cetera, they are a responsibility. And I think that, as a country, we have to man up, and we have to, ensure that our security services have the resources necessary to identify these individuals before they travel or before they plan acts on Canadian soil. Because, to cite the current Prime Minister, a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. And it doesn't matter where that person decides to try and kill innocent people, whether it's here or abroad, we own that one. And I think that we have to acknowledge that and take what steps, Herculean steps possible to prevent those illegal acts from happening.
Very good point, Phil. A very good point. Actually, in keeping with that, I'd like to ask you one more question, if that's okay.
Sure.
With, as we were saying, the changing narrative, and even the definition of nationalism, white supremacy, the shift to far-right politics as a seemingly getting more coverage today. The events that occurred on July 6th, mm-hmm. I think that is something that has become extraordinarily politicized, in the sense that it would be very erroneous to say this is an act of insurgency, or this is an act of a riot, or there was so much perplexity. I think in many cases, though, so many individuals got caught up in it, and you just wound up, now we're in Congress, now we're here, now we're just ended up walking here. Now, certainly there were many acts that were committed that were criminal acts, that were disgusting. I mean, people were wiping feces on floors and taking stuff, and theft, federal theft. Okay, yes, all acknowledged, but not everyone was doing that. It would be, I think, too quick, and I don't like things that are done too quick with the matters of national security, any sort, that to say all of them collectively are a part of X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem. It seems that event is just too eclectic, too much going on with it. The individuals, everything. I don't think everyone was driven by some sort of far right mentality to take down something. I just don't see that.
I agree completely with you. So, of course, you're referring to the January 6th attack on the Capitol that was spurred on by Trump's allegations the election had been stolen. Again, I was one of the few saying, time out here. This was an act of domestic terrorism. Okay, first of all, if it was a pretty shitty act of domestic terrorism because nobody died. One cop died, but he died of a heart attack or a stroke. He didn't die from the actual attack itself. Secondly, they were incredibly boneheaded. They didn't really do anything. And I think you're right. We're seeing a bit of a narrative shift in the United States as well since Biden's taken over. Mm-hmm. It's all about what they call it domestic terrorism, which is basically a synonym for right-wing extremism. Because they have Islamist extremists who are domestic as well. They don't call it that. The Americans have a bizarre system in that in order to be called an Islamist terrorist, you have to have an international link, which is completely backwards. In terms of, the link shouldn't matter. It's what the ideology is. To me, January the 6th was I call it a frat party gone wrong. I think a lot of people were ramped up by the ex-president. They already had beefs and they already had things on their mind. They wanted to show up in force to make their point. The security was lousy. They breached the security. They got into the Capitol. And I think most of them said, holy shit, now what do we do? Yeah. We didn't expect to be in here. I'm going to spread feces on Nancy Pelosi's chair, or I'm going to take a selfie. Interestingly, to the best of my knowledge, there have been no charges of domestic terrorism that have been levied against anybody that took place. I mean, there've been, I don't know what the federal statutes are, but there's probably trespassing, there's probably damage to a federal institution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that was not an act of terrorism. That was a riot. And again, going back to our earlier points, Matt, you're right. When we start lumping in all these things together, we really lose sight of the fact that you can't pin the terrorism label on everything. Canada had no anti-terrorism legislation until after 9/11.
Yes.
It came into the criminal code in December of 2001. In other words, we prosecuted people who committed acts of terrorism under other elements of the criminal code. Yes. Murder, attempted murder, premeditation, et cetera, et cetera. I've often argued, and I'm somebody who worked in counterterrorism for 15 years. I've written 6 books on the topic. I think we could get rid of the word terrorism tomorrow and be no less effective in dealing with these people from other legal tools. Because at the end of the day, you look what happened, whether it was in Quebec City or the Toronto 18, or what happened to Nathan Cirillo on October 24th or 22nd rather, 2014. Both people were murdered or people they were planning to murder. You can charge them with, under the criminal code, intent to murder or having killed somebody. And interestingly, again, going back to Quebec City, Alexandre Bissonnette was not charged with terrorism. He was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder and 5 counts of attempted murder, to which he pleaded guilty, to which he got a 40-year sentence. The guy in Edmonton in September 2017 who drove a van down, he hit a cop outside Commonwealth Stadium, and he drove his van down Jasper Avenue, hitting 5 people. I mean, in total, like 6 people were wounded. Had an ISIS flag on the dashboard. He was not charged with terrorism. He was charged with attempted murder, and he was convicted on attempted murder.
Right.
So you ask yourself, what's the point? And the problem with terrorism, as we alluded to today, terrorism is complicated. If I plan to kill you, and I don't, Matt, trust me, I'm not planning to kill you. But if I do,
I appreciate that.
If I do, that can be found out. You can find emails I sent to you, or I purchased certain weapons, or I was following you, blah blah. I can prove that I was planning to kill you. Why I was planning to kill you, that's a completely different issue.
Yes.
And you have to ask yourself, why do I need to prove the why? Is it really important? We've shown through our court system that we can get successful prosecutions without giving a rat's ass about the why.
Precisely. I mean,
so if terrorism were to disappear from the statutes tomorrow, nothing would change.
No, I don't think it would at all. I think, well, 2 things I think of that. I think we are fortunate to not have the, for lack of a better word, the bombardment of terror-related legislation as the U.S. does, and the layers of it, I guess you might say. But I think that also plays in the fact that they have been greatly more directly affected than we have.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think one only needs to prove criminality. Not all criminals are terrorists, but all terrorists are criminals. I don't know. I don't know. This is coming from my perspective, but I think that's it. I think you wouldn't have any change in it. You would actually have perhaps more successful persecutions, as opposed to what we initially started talking about with somebody running around trying to prove 1, 2, 3, 4 these acts of terrorist-related activity, and what that means when we know visually, we know empirically that this person, this was part of this group, or was a member of this organization, or what say you, but we can't find the quote unquote evidence to convict. You can prove criminality. I think is a lot easier and a lot more successful.
There's an interesting case going on now. I believe it was in January of 2020. Again, another so-called incel, or that's what he was described as, went to a massage parlor or something in Toronto, killed one woman and wounded another, and was charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder. In May of last year, the Crown decided to up those charges to terrorism. Okay, this is interesting. Let's say it goes to trial, and the Crown is unable to demonstrate that this was an act of terrorism, i.e. it was ideologically, politically, or religiously motivated. Does the case fail? And then you get into the problem of double indemnity. If I've been found innocent or not proven guilty on the charge the first time, the Crown can say, oh, we've changed our mind now. Now we're going to charge you with murder.
Right.
No, because you've blown it. So why would you take a slam dunk? The man killed a woman. That is a fact. That is an incontrovertible fact. Any idiot, my cat can prove that. And my cat's been dead since 2014, right? Why would you take the chance of trying to prove the motivation behind it, which, by the way, is not going to add to the sentence? Terrorism is not like hate crime in Canada. Under hate crimes, if the judge determines that you're found guilty of a particular act and the judge determines that it was motivated by hate, the judge has the leeway under Canadian law to increase the sentence. The same thing doesn't happen for terrorism, to the best of my knowledge. So the Crown's taking a big chance on this one. And I do think that the decision to up the charges from murder and attempted murder to terrorism 5 months later was a purely political act that serves nobody here in Canada. It's just, it's kowtowing to this notion that incel is somehow a terrorist movement, which of course it is not. I've had a lot of conversations with Nama Cates on my website, and she's the world's premier expert on incel. She's talked to thousands of them, and she agrees with me. Like, 0.00001% of all incels are violent.
Exactly.
And so but it's
her
again,
research, her research is impeccable on this too. So
yeah, it's feeding the narrative somehow that the Islamists have had their day, and now it's this right-wing guy. It's old white guys like me that are a problem, and that's where we're going to focus our resources. So, yeah, I think it could be a colossal error on the part of the Crown if they can't prove that what happened in January 2020 was actually an act of terrorism, and they would have gotten an easy conviction on first-degree murder.
Very much so. No, I concur with you on this. This is I'm not even sure what's driven by this. I'm really is it just purely political? Is it
I think so.
Is it? I mean, what's the gain? That's what I'm always trying to find in my head. Like, what's the end goal for if you're just trying to, a young lawyer trying to just get your time in court and get a little coverage here, but even that's not necessarily part of it. I mean,
well, there's been a movement in the past couple of years to like get rid of terms like Islamist terrorism. It's seen as racist, despite the fact it's completely accurate.
I mean, we've seen that as recent shifts in Australia, of all places.
I know.
Which was shocking to me, very shocking.
The Aussies would have been the last people I would have thought that would bow to political correctness, and yet they're doing it as well. And it's going to end badly, I think.
Yes. No, I think it's very unfortunate. It's very unfortunate because at the end of the day, these terms, for lack of say it, they're meaningless. We don't have any historical definition to them. We know what Islamist terrorist acts are. Terrorism is. We know what Sikh terrorism is. We know what Catholic Christian terrorism is. We know what Buddhist terrorists act like. They have particular manifestations, but they all do so in a different way, and we know they are historically. To now just to wipe away and just throw in new terms. You're really tying the hands for critical imagery, tying the hands of analysts and agencies behind their back, saying now try and figure out stuff.
Yeah, like I said, we're sacrificing accuracy on the altar of political correctness, and I get political correctness, I get why it happens, but my advice is to the government: just get out of the way of the securities, let them do their jobs.
Exactly.
They know how they've been doing it for decades. Just stay out of the way. And whether or not you act on their intelligence, that's a whole other issue. We in Canada have a checkered past when it comes to intelligence actually feeding policy. That's an entire other podcast, Matt. This is not helpful at all. And I'm fearful for what the end game is going to be in all this.
I concur with you immensely, Phil, and I'd like to thank you. I think this has been an insightful, extraordinary conversation, and I'd like to have you on again in the future and talk some more as well.
I would love to come back. It's always nice to have a conversation with somebody who I think asks the really good, insightful, both terms of insightful. Insightful as inciting and insightful as an insight. These are important questions, and I think it's important to have this conversation because. If you just listen to the sound bites out there, unfortunately, you're not getting the details. And I get it. We live in a soundbite world. Nobody wants to listen to more than 15 seconds of information. And, as somebody who's done probably thousands, if not tens of thousands of interviews in the past 6 years, I get my 3 minutes like anybody else. And there's not a lot you can say in 3 minutes that's of any value. So thank you very much for taking the time to have me on the podcast.